Content warning. This dramatized reconstitution contains references to slavery, the sale of a child, and violence. Names and details have been adapted from oral memories and placed in 1832 for this narrative. She had a price written in ink on a ledger. The child had a name whispered into the dark. The ledger and the whisper lived in the same house, under the same roof, where numbers moved through rooms like a second language, and people were often spoken of as if they were inventory. The lady thought she could own the ledger and the language both. One mother kept a name like a talisman in the hollow of her palm. Luía kept the name close enough to feel it as a small, steady heat through the coldest nights. Elisa slept like a bird under her ribs, a weight and a breath and a reason. The senzala smelled of wet earth and sweat and the smoke from the evening fires. It smelled of children's hair after the sun. The House Grande smelled of wax and ledger dust and the faint metallic tang of coins. Between those scents ran a seam of law and violence, one unquestioned, unquestioning, practiced until it seemed as natural as breathing. They were on an estate of sugar and cane in Minas, the great huts set back from the road, where traders brought their ledgers and their polite smiles. The lady, Shaha, as some called her in a way that put iron in the sound, kept the doors of the House Grande shut against the noise of the fields. She wore her power like a shawl, neatly folded and never misplaced. She chose the children when she would. She counted them with a footfall and a look. On market days, the capataz stood at the gate with a ledger and a list, and the merchants adjusted their hats, and the world was given names and prices. Luía did not know numbers in the way the House Grande did. She knew a child's face in weather and illness, the pattern of a cough, the exact way a cheek would sink after too little milk. She knew how to braid hair for sleep so that morning songs would not catch in tangles. She knew the curve of Elisa's ear and the way the child would clutch two fingers like a promise. She had learned to count in a different way, the minutes until the bell, the rounds of the capataz's boots, the hours of waiting. The sale happened in winter light, thin and grey. It was not loud, not at first, only the quiet rustle of ledger paper and the polite scratching of a quill. The lady's hand paused at the list, then moved, then signalled. The capataz's voice, steady and small, named a price. There was a merchant with a face like old leather who nodded, and the child was led away without the language the child would need. Explanation, consolation, the lie of futures. Luía's world narrowed to a single hollow in her chest. It was not sudden. Grief had always been a slow thing on that estate, a long wear of cold patches on the skin, but that day grief grew teeth. She found herself walking toward the House Grande as if pulled on a string, a woman carrying only a rag and the memory of a tiny hand. She saw the ledger, heavy and alive, the ink a black throat that swallowed names. She saw the merchant adjust his satchel and taste his coin. She felt the ledger's hunger and answered with a name. They took more than a child that afternoon. They took into account, for their accounts, all the possible futures Elisa might have had. The scraped knee healed by a mother's hand, the first crooked tooth, the way she would have run from the smoke at dusk. Those were things you could not list in ink. The estate could convert a body into a sum, but it could not turn a held look into an entry. In the weeks after, Luía moved as though through two worlds. There was the visible one, washing, mending, fetching water for the House Grande, bending in the fields with the rest, and the private geography of loss, where every corner held an ache. She would stand by the fence and set her face toward the direction the merchant had taken, as if she could will the wagon back. She would press her face into the folds of the hem, because cloth remembers warmth. She would whisper Elisa's name in the small hours, and the name was both prayer and objection. Other women watched her with hands that remembered their own losses. Grief on that land was not solitary. It threaded through the sensibilities of the senzala like a common tune. Old women who had seen more seasons than the House Grande could count, women who had been mothers and aunts in other times and places, moved with a slow, knowing sympathy. They brought cassava cakes and a folded piece of bread when they could. They came with stories, too, stories of which merchants took what children and why, stories of what men like Benedito supplied when they came to the bar. Benedito was a merchant with many things under his satchel and a steady way of looking at people as if they were a risk to be assessed rather than human beings. Benedito's face was a ledger of its own. Lines, scores, the kind of caution that keeps a man in trade for many years. He moved through the estate with the arrogance of one used to doors opening before him, and yet he had learned to lower his voice when he entered the senzala. It was in the small times, when their hands brushed while passing a jar, when a seamstress offered him tea, that Luía watched him and estimated what sort of man he was. He dealt in goods that the House Grande needed, and in the things the capataz ordered discreetly. He also dealt in information. Joaquina was different. Where Benedito calculated, Joaquina stitched. She was a seamstress, a woman whose hands could make new from old and who had a mild, plotting intelligence. Joaquina's shop was a narrow room in the back of the senzala, where fabric scraps became dolls and patches became pockets. She listened with a softness that could contain dangerous things, and when Luía came to her with hands raw from crying, Joaquina did not avert her eyes. Instead, she leaned in, fingers still threaded with needle and linen. "We keep names," Joaquina said once, folding scraps like prayers into neat squares. "We keep them inside us. We do what we can." Luía learned how networks made themselves. A pot of broth passed under a fence, a child hidden in a clothing hamper while a visitor called. The women had ways of softening each other's losses, practicalities that were also acts of defiance. A shirt sewn with an extra hem might hide a folded note. A consignment of cassava might carry a child along the back road under the cover of night. They were used to making small revolutions, to turning sorrow into action in ways that would not announce themselves too loudly. If Luía wanted to undo what had been done, she understood already that there was no legal remedy to name and return what had been priced away. The law and custom that governed the estate moved in the House Grande's favor, thick as syrup and just as slow to change. A mother could not enter the ledger. She could speak, but no court would hear her voice in the same weight as a merchant's coin. This was a truth taught by years of watching men and ledgers. What Luía had other than the tenacity of a mother was time spent learning the estate's whispers. She learned to read the day's rhythms, when the capataz relaxed his gait, when the lady took her afternoon tea in front of the parlor window, when merchants came and left and which servants were likely to be absent. She learned the places where secrets could be smuggled, a hollow board beneath the stairs, a seam in a coat that had been patched too often, the loose mortar behind the hearth. This knowledge did not make her safe, it simply made her possible. She began slowly to gather small things. A scrap of cloth from Joaquina became a pouch. A hush became a promise. What these women collected were not only items, but also the courage to name a different future. There was talk among them that day, talk that moved like a breath between the women, of retribution, of exposure, of public reckoning. But their words were cautious and measured. They did not leap into violence for sport. The economy of violence on the estate had always belonged to the House Grande. To take it back even a little required judgment. Luía's decisions were not sudden combustions. They were assembled slowly, by repeated small calculations. The memory of a child's laugh, the knowledge that the House Grande had systems that could be turned against it, the way a ledger's numbers ignored the tendered, living weight of a mother's arms. She found people who listened more than they spoke. Among them were those who had suffered hands-on abuse and those who had learned how to bend the estate's friction into something useful. The capataz, Juan Ignacio, had a watchful eye. He carried chains like proof of his duty and walked as a man who expected respect. He knew the patterns of the senzala almost as well as the women did. That is what made him dangerous. He could see in the small shifts. A woman staying longer by the water, a child left with a neighbor. He was not cruel for cruelty's sake, most of the men were not, but for the continuity of power, to curb motion, to make sure nothing threatened the ledger's neatness. Juan Ignacio did not trust Benedito, but he relied on him. The House Grande trusted its men to protect its goods, and to them people were part of that calculus. One afternoon, as Luía pulled a small hem closed, she noticed that a jar had been placed improperly on the high kitchen shelf in the House Grande storeroom. It was an ordinary misplacement, a dish stacked wrong, a kettle not put in its place. To most people, it would have been a trivial detail. To Luía, it was a narrow doorway. She had long watched the storeroom from the back steps, noting, with a thief's patience, what came and went. The storeroom was where the House Grande kept both the banal and the necessary. fabrics, spices, oils, and whatever else the lady could not bear to keep in the parlor on display. There were jars that collected dust like testimony. She learned from Joaquina and the older women about Benedito's deliveries. A crate here, a sack there, the quietness of certain boxes. They did not speak of names for these goods. They mentioned only that sometimes men from the town left behind bottles with labels scrubbed or jars wrapped in paper. These were the kinds of things a House Grande used. Harsh cleaners, distilled spirits, something that burned rather than soothed. Luía did not need to know the contents in chemical terms. She needed only to recognize the jar when it came by sight and scent. That recognition came one dusk. The storeroom had a small window that let in a filament of light where dust hung like late flight. Someone, perhaps Benedito, perhaps one of the errand boys, had set a jar on the shelf slightly forward from the others. It was unremarkable at first glance, a squat glass vessel with a cork. It carried a smell that tugged at the back of the throat, sharp and clean. Luía stared at the jar until the sweat cooled on her neck. She lifted it only when she was sure no other eye could witness the act, and then not for long, only a furtive touch, the weight of it in her hand, the way the glass clicked against her palm. She did not know the name for what lay within, and she would never have the knowledge to make it herself. That had always been part of the estate's cruel intelligence, to have the dangerous things under lock and key, to keep the methods of harm as the property of the powerful. She wrapped the jar in a scrap and tucked it into the hollow she'd made in the hem of a patched gown. It fit like a secret. Each time she passed the storeroom after that, her steps tightened and loosened like a muscle remembering motion. Joaquina sewed into the seam and whispered a prayer that was not for safety, but for discretion. The women around her did not instruct. They murmured. They taught each other how to carry the impossible weight of a plan without letting it stray into rumor. There were near discoveries. In the late afternoons when the House Grande's servants brought trays out for guests, Luía felt the capataz's shadow move like weather. Once, Juan Ignacio paused by the water pump and called her name. No accusation, only a question that was a test. Her hands were wet, her eyes steady, and she answered with a curtsy and a false laugh. The capataz's gaze passed through her, like wind passing through a curtain that would not billow. Another time, a child in the senzala saw something like a glint in her skirt and asked a question, and Luía covered and blinked and turned the child's curiosity into a story about a moth. The small daily deceptions risked everything, yet the fabric of those deceptions was what kept them alive. They spoke in cautious hours of public exposure. The elder women had a strategy not of vengeance as spectacle, but of forcing the House Grande to face its own deeds in public light. That kind of exposure could rip the respectable veils off the estate. It could make neighbors and priests see what ledger entries claimed otherwise. It was a dangerous calculus to shift a private injury into a public scandal. The women knew that the law would turn to protect the House Grande. The sheriff and the neighboring landowners would rally to restore order. But they also knew that a spectacle is a mirror that sometimes refuses to tilt back. Luía's plan, if such a violent word can be used against a desperate wound, began as a moral reasoning. If the ledger could name children and the House Grande could make that name small, then perhaps public naming could undo some of that smallness. She did not imagine a single strike that would unmake the centuries of property law. She imagined a scene, a tearing of a curtain, enough to make the ledger's lines tremble in front of witnesses, enough to force the lady into a moment she could not write away. Benedito observed more than he traded. Men who trade learn to hear what others cannot. Benedito had a way of sitting at the edge of conversation and appearing to be doing nothing while the rest of the room bared itself. He liked the thrill of a secret transaction, but he liked his safety more. When Luía approached him, through an intermediary because she could not speak freely in his hearing, he listened with the amusement of a man whose life required seeing combinations of profit and risk where others saw only outcome. "He'll not ask questions if the price is right," Benedito had said in a low voice, as if discussing the weather. He meant that there are things merchants prefer not to know. He did not ask where the ledgers did not fit his coin. He took what the House Grande would sell and what the House Grande would buy. Yet even Benedito, who traded in delicate silks and the rough edges of agricultural supplies, had limits. Luía's interactions with him were full of ritual humility, and a fierce undercurrent of resolve. She traded for bread and salt under the pretense of paying for work, but what she really paid for was a blindness, the kind of bought silence that allowed her to move within the estate with less immediate oversight. There were other small transactions, an extra bowl placed under a cart, a note slipped into a coat. Each was a brushstroke in a larger picture. They were also risks of exposure. A neighbor who counted Benedito's coins might notice a discrepancy and tell João Inácio out of loyalty or fear. It is important to say that none of the women wanted violence for its own sake. They wanted reparation, recognition, a voice in a system that treated them as absence. The world in which they lived taught them in every language that certain kinds of power are preserved by the quiet acceptance of the rest. To refuse that acceptance was to choose a different kind of life, one that might bring consequences they could not fully know. Luía taught herself to keep her face ordinary. When she worked in the House Grande, she stood at the edge with her hands in the wash listening for the pattern of voices. When she returned to the senzala, she knelt by the little ones and hummed a song that had no name and that carried new words, words of keeping and remembering. She replayed the ledger's contempt and, like a slow tempering, transformed it into something else, a waiting, a readiness, a willingness to be counted differently. The nights before the chosen act were thin with sleeplessness. She lay on the packed earth and could hear the world as if it were an instrument tuned too high. The way the capataz's boots struck the veranda, the whisper of a carriage, the soft rattle of wine in the House Grande's cellar. She wrapped the jar in her hem and felt its secret weight press against her thigh, a companion that grew less foreign and more like a small animal breathing. In the morning she watched the lady move through the House Grande with an ease that belonged to inherited habit. The lady's hands were never unadorned. She drank tea as if tasting the estate itself. She smiled sometimes to guests or to the men who brought accounts. She did not presently seem monstrous in any obvious theatrical sense. She was, instead, the ordinary kind of authority, neat, confident, used to her orders being seen as right by those who had been taught to obey. That ordinariness made the ledger's cruelty more dangerous. It had the face of normalcy. Among the women who planned, there was an unspoken rule. Do not become a caricature of violence. They wanted the House Grande to feel the consequences of its own logic, but they did not want to take on the faces of brutality. They wanted to hold the moral high ground, even as they bent the estate's rules. It was a discipline of the heart, a stubborn refusal to let anger alone be the guide. Luía rehearsed in her mind what exposure might look like. She imagined the House Grande's parlor filled with neighbors and traders and priests, the lady in the center like a small sun, and the ledger open like a throat. She imagined a sound that might not be a child's cry but something else, the sudden, terrible revelation of a system shown to those who had been allowed to ignore it. She imagined the faces of men who would look away, and of women who would, for a moment, finally understand. She imagined not total triumph, no such thing was within the realm of a single act, but a tremor that could for a little while interrupt the smooth surface of daily life. On the day that would be chosen, the estate expected a procession. The lady would host a small gathering to show off a new carriage, to receive a visiting magistrate, to display the stability of the household. There would be food, laughter that practiced civility, and the ledger would be quietly proud. It was habit, these manifestations of propriety, that Luía planned to pierce. The lady would step into a public space where the ledger's power could be witnessed by those who usually read it with complacency. There was fear among the conspirators. There were practical nightmares, capture, floggings, the snatching away of the living remnant of the women's networks. The women imagined the sheriff making example of them. They imagined the House Grande erecting safeguards that would make all their small movements impossible. But they also imagined the ledger being turned into a thing that might be seen by others for what it was, an instrument of dispossession that could not hold up in sunlight. Luía did not romanticize her eventual step. There were no illusions that a single act would heal her wholly. There were no illusions that the ledger's ink could be wiped clean. She knew that any success would come with consequences, and that even victory would be complicated. She thought of Elisa often then, not as a simple emblem but as a living, missing person whose absence pressed on her constantly. In her plan, Elisa's name was not a slogan. It was the axis of a truth the ledger had tried to ignore. The night before the gathering, Luía sat in the outer yard under the aloe bushes and listened to the estate breathe. Strings of stars hung above, indifferent and innumerable. Joaquina brought a small bowl of porridge and sat beside her, the two women bound by more than plot, by the simple history of sharing food, of mending tears, of tending each other's children when illness took a mother. Joaquina's hands were steady as she pressed a scrap of cloth into Luía's palm. "This is not the same as before," Joaquina said softly, not intending to console so much as to anchor. "But some things do not change. We keep names. We keep them safe. Do not forget you will have sisters when this is done or undone." Luía looked at Joaquina and felt the insistence of community like a strap around her chest. "I will not forget," she said, and in the small syllable there was the depth of all she had been carrying. They rehearsed the timing in their heads like a prayer. The women agreed that the moment would be simple and immediate, an exposure that could not be argued away by law or rhetoric. It must be public and clear. The ledger could be shown for what it was. They had chosen their witnesses deliberately, traders who had come for that day, neighbors, the magistrate, even some of the House Grande's staff who might be made uncomfortable enough to ask questions. When the dawn came, the estate moved through its morning rituals as if through oil. Cooks lit fires beneath copper pans, the lady's maid brushed sleeves until they shone, the capataz polished boots with a certain balance between zeal and indifference. Men read parts of the ledger and made notes. A carriage rolled in with a gentle clop of hooves, and the visiting magistrate, an outwardly official man who liked to see how order appeared on other people's properties, was shown to a seat facing the House Grande's parlor. Luía tucked the jar into its seam one last time and felt it press like a reminder. She walked like a woman who had no other name. Her face betrayed nothing. That was the point. When a child asked for a crumb, she smiled and gave it. When João Inácio barked an order, she obeyed with the artifice of a servant whose life had been practiced into gestures of compliance. The worst parts of the plan were the waiting, the invisible hours where a false normalcy must be sustained. She did not think of herself as a villain. She thought of herself as a mother made by loss. She told herself gently that what she would do was not an act to celebrate, but a last recourse in a world that had denied her recourse. The women had argued about whether to make the act itself violent, and mostly they had agreed that the moral edge of their case required that the exposure be visible, undeniable, but not a recreation of the estate's own savagery. There was discipline in that restraint. There was also the pain of knowing that to avoid one kind of violence might necessitate another. As the household took its seats and the platter lids were lifted, Luía moved like a shadow toward the place where the visitors would gather. She felt the jar warm against her, felt her pulse like a small hammer. Her breath made no sound in her ears. She had memorized the face of the lady, the cut of her sleeve, the way she lifted a cup with a small, practiced grace. Luía wondered, for a flash, what the lady had been like as a child. She tried to imagine the ledger as a thing that had been taught to someone who now only repeated what she'd learned. The thought did not excuse. It only complicated the human shape of the enemy. The guests began to comment on the estate's crops, on the size of the harvest, on the sharpness of the air. The magistrate murmured something about the order of things, and how well such order was maintained here. Traders nodded and smiled, as if satisfaction could be bottled and sold. The lady sat, cool and precise, and looked like someone for whom questions were only a season. Luía stepped out of the shadows with the careful timing they had practiced. She moved into the sun where the carriage would pass, where the lady would stand to greet the magistrate. She felt every eye in a place where they had not expected it, on her and on whatever she carried. Her hands did not shake. She had learned that trembling would be a confession. Her mind narrowed to the seam, the name in her mouth. The ledgers recorded indifference. She thought of Elisa, of hair like a child's broom, of small hands that had once closed around 2 fingers, of a laugh that would start and then stop at the sound of a man's voice. She thought of the ledger's ink as a wound that had been sewn without care. She thought with a hard, honest clarity that the ledger must be shown. The moment of carrying out the plan made time thin and sharp, like the edge of a blade. And then she stepped forward into the brightness where the house's world would meet hers. She stepped forward into the brightness where the house's world would meet hers. The carriage rolled like a punctuation mark. The magistrate's hat caught the sun. For a moment, everything in Luía's chest was as clear as a bell. The ledger's ink, the small hand that had once closed around 2 fingers, the hem she had turned so many times until it fit like a second skin. If any prayer lived in that instant, it was not for herself. It was the name she kept warm under her tongue, Elisa. There were people between Luía and the lady, traders in their good coats, neighbors who had come to show civility, servants who had already been taught where to stand. The lady moved as if she were at the center of a painting, and the painting had always made the rules. She smiled. The magistrate complimented the neatness of her estate. The ledger rested in a corner like a thing that justified the scene. Luía drew her hand from the hem. The jar was cool for a beat, then warm with the heat of her body. She held it as one holds a note found in a grave, not to melt it, but to remember its shape. There was no flourish. She did not shout. She took the step the women had rehearsed and put her hand up as if to smooth the air. The sound that followed was not the thing itself, but the sound of everyone realizing the world had tilted. There was a soft, metallic clatter as someone moved, a sudden cut in the polite conversation. A child began to cry. The magistrate started, lips parted as if for a syllable he had not been taught. The lady's smile faltered. The ledger fell from a servant's hands and opened like a mouth. No one could have said afterward whether the first noise was a gasp or a broken spoon. People clustered like birds startled into the sky. What Luía did was a single, fierce action, a throw that belonged to her alone, not a long demonstration but an incision into the day's order. The jar left her palm and flew in a short arc. There was light on the glass, and then the glass met its distance. The impact was not described by any of the men who later testified as a precise sequence of chemical steps. They described instead the way the lady's hands rose reflexively to her face and the sound she made when something hot and wrong had touched her skin. There were shrieks. Some women cried out in pity, some in alarm. Silence followed in a pressure so sharp it felt like a cut. In that pressure the ledger's function changed. Men who had always read its lines as neutral numbers found that the numbers now added up to a story they could not ignore, a story with a child's name at its center. The merchant who had accepted the sale stood as if struck. The magistrate's composed face cracked with the first small doubt. Servants murmured. The capataz moved toward Luía with a speed that was practiced, but his hands were not the only force in the air. The people there saw something they had been taught to avoid seeing and could not put the sight back into its box. The lady's face, once carefully composed, became a map of astonishment and pain. There was no need to dwell on injury. The important thing for those present was that she could not deny, from the angle of witnesses, from the smear on her sleeve, from the sound that turned polite laughter into a chorus of alarm, that a reckoning had come into public air. For the first time, the ledger's supposed neutrality was contested in a place it had always had privilege to command. A woman had torn the curtain, and the curtain lay in the dust. The House Grande erupted as if shaken by an animal. Servants ran for water and rags. Men shouted for order, for the sheriff, for the law. João Inácio moved with the authority of the estate, his voice cutting through the confusion as he ordered hands to grasp and feet to chase. The traders clustered, instinctively drawing their bodies back from danger and from scandal, and some looked at one another as if to ask if the morning were still a place of contracts. Luía did not watch the lady's face. She watched the faces of those who had come to witness propriety. Some were puzzled, some indignant for the wrong reasons, some suddenly self-conscious. She heard a child's wail and thought of the little fingers that had once closed around hers. That sound, so small and honest, laid itself over the whole morning and made everything else thin and brittle. The capataz lunged and hands closed on Luía's arm. It was a practiced net. She felt the grip like weather. Someone called out her name with a voice she recognized, João Inácio, not above tenderness, but above mercy in the service of order. For a breath there was the possibility of capture, of punishment, made performative to set an example. The men had an institution to defend, and such lessons were their trade. They would stage retribution to reassert the ledger's authority. But the women had planned for the hand that would seize hers. Beneath the greatness of the scene, hidden in the millimeters between one movement and the next, the seamstresses and the older women tilted the world's small gears. A cart loaded with firewood, an errand boy sent with a message, a tray dropped as if by accident. Such countersigns had been practiced until they could be made to look like happenstance. Joaquina's hands found Luía's in the mass of bodies, quick, sure, and with a movement that had been rehearsed a dozen times she freed her and pulled her toward the shadow of the hedge. They ran, not in a dramatic sprint, but in the contained speed of people who understand how to vanish, past the stables, through a gate that had always been slightly less guarded, along a path only the women who worked it could see. The capataz barked, orders followed like a drum. "Stop them, seize her!" Men ran and docked their stride for the rough soil. A horse began to bolt. Screams chased the fleeing forms. Behind them, the House Grande convulsed into its own rituals of repair. The magistrate, appalled and embarrassed, demanded calm and legal process. The neighbors whispered about scandal and indecency, and the merchants checked their hats and their reputations. The lady's attendants fussed, coaxing her into the parlor and into silence, into the make-up of propriety where wounds could be hidden under veils. The ledger was closed and set aside, but the sound of it was in the air, louder than before. Luía felt the weight of the world press at her back, and the hands that pulled her. No one who pulled her was a stranger. Joaquina kept one hand to her shoulder and guided their path with knowledge of the service doors, with the map of places where watchers blinked and tolerated. An old woman with a basket, one of the network, met them at a side path and took a child into her arms as if to carry a message. A boy who usually ran errands for Benedito slipped them a small loaf wrapped in cloth. People who had risked for one another in small ways now enlarged their courage. They moved through nights with a pace that refused the broad streets. The escape to the Quilombo would not be an immediate miracle. It would be a seam of night stitched together with human hands. The Quilombo, where it existed, was a place memory had turned into a refuge, a scattering of huts beyond the cane fields, the sound of the river like a constant witness. It was not a utopia. The Quilombo had its own rules and its wary welcome, its debates about whether harboring fugitives invited punishment that would spill backward like oil. The first miles were a blur of breaths and ground. Luía kept her name like a talisman. She had no clear plan beyond moving away from the House Grande and toward the place where people might choose to hide her. The women who sheltered her moved with the economy of small precautions. A shawl thrown over the shoulders, a child's game used to cover a hurried conversation, a false path that sent pursuers in circles. They were not invincible. They were not a plotted militia. They were a group of people who had learned how to make holes in a world that insisted on being whole. As dusk swallowed the fields, they came to the river. The crossing was a ritual learned by many who had fled before, a rope, a small skiff, a hand at the prow. Luía stepped into the water and felt it take her ankles first, then the cold that makes you alive in a way you had forgotten. The Quilombo's leaders had sent scouts who met them at the far bank, faces that held both welcome and the hard question of cost. They took Luía in under a low roof, and for a while she simply let herself be. Her arrival did not unmake the consequences that followed in the estate's wake. The magistrate wrote hurried letters to neighboring landowners, and the sheriff, who took orders seriously, read those letters with a face like frost. Orders were given to tighten patrols, to account for every person who crossed the land. The capataz, João Inácio, tired of being shown how his authority could slip, began to make a show of control. Extra roll calls, punishments visited on those who had been suspected of aiding in any way. Old women who had given a cup of soup were dragged into interrogations. Children were taken away from families as warnings. The ledger's response was a kind of violence that aimed to teach the senzala a new, sharper lesson. The press, so far as the gossip of the county could be called press, filled in the scene with the terms that made sense to men who read for markets rather than for truth. A letter to a periodical in the nearest town called the episode a crude assault by a servant woman. Another, written more cautiously by a clerk who had known the magistrate, hinted at scandal and the uneasy fit between public appearances and private economies. News travelled not in straight lines, but in the braids of conversation. At the market, in the priest's hush, in the wagons that carried goods off the estate, Benedito became, for a time, a man watched more closely. Those who sought to understand the event searched for a name who could be held accountable other than the woman who had acted. A merchant's silence had many shades. Some interpreted his reluctance to speak as conscience, others as calculation. He kept his distance and his books. He said, in a depositions recorded later in a clerk's hand, that he had seen nothing out of the ordinary, beyond an upset that demanded the law's attention. His testimony smoothed edges for some and hardened them for others. In the Quilombo, Luía was sheltered but not coronated. There were warm hands and sharp questions. Leaders welcomed her and did not pretend to agree on the moral calculus. Some argued that exposing the House Grande had been necessary, a deed that balanced, if imperfectly, a ledger that had always been dishonest. Others worried that harboring such an act could bring ruin to many. They feared retaliations that would cost children and livelihoods. The Quilombo's elders had lived long enough to know the calculus of risk. They had also taken in people whose actions had been shaped by the rawest forms of grief. Luía did not explain herself in long speeches. She spoke of Elisa in short phrases, as if the name itself were a geography she could not revise. "She had my laugh in her mouth," she would say to those who asked. "She smelled of cassava and of the heat of the hearth." These fragments were enough to make the community press around her like a shield. They bandaged her wounds of fear and fed her with a care that was not performative but practical. They argued into the night about what would be wise. Some said she should move on to other territories, farther from the estate. Others counseled patience to see what the magistrate's next steps would be. Survival, they knew, was sometimes the slow craft of waiting. Back on the estate, reprisals were not slow. The House Grande could not by habit allow the ledger's authority to be questioned without a spectacle of its own. Men were flogged on the green, not because they had offended some abstract standard, but because public correction was the language the estate used to teach compliance. The lady, no longer able to wear the public mask without visible sign, retreated into solitude and law. She pressed charges. She demanded restitution. Her defenders argued that order must be maintained. But the public is not a single voice. As the magistrate sought to impose a tidy legal narrative, small fissures appeared in the consensual story. Neighbors who had once admired the House Grande whispered about the truth of sales and about seeing children leave. A servant who had once kept a ledger clean gave a testimony, quiet, hesitant, that spoke of nights when bread and laundry had been its own kind of ledger. These hints did not overthrow the law, but they altered the tone of rumor. For some, the lady's injury became not simply an assault, but a mirror that reflected an uncomfortable commerce. The sheriff's men fanned out, looking for Luía and for those who had aided her. Letters were sent to towns farther afield. Rewards, small and careful, were offered for information. The magistrate and the neighbors wanted closure, a containment that the law could produce in rituals of arrest and punishment. Yet the Quilombo's very existence made containment incomplete. There were places where law's reach thinned, and within those margins, people practiced another set of rules. People whom the estate considered absent or missing became part of a continuing history that law did not catalogue. In the weeks that followed, Benedito's ledger lost some of its neatness. The merchant, who had always valued commerce over conscience, found himself counted in ways he had not expected. Men who had trusted his discretion now looked to him with suspicion. He found the ease of trade replaced by attention he could not count. His silence had been a commodity, but commodities had a fragile morality. Whether he felt guilt or only fear, whether he had helped, ignored, or merely looked away, he lived now with a knowledge that men of account sometimes cannot keep. They are also part of the story. Luía's name, whispered in certain quarters, took on different valences. To some she was a criminal, to others a mother who had wrenched a truth from a system that would not otherwise speak. In the Quilombo she became, slowly, a teacher of sorts, of how to make choices when law bends its ear only to the powerful, of how to keep a child's name alive, of how to bind your small rebellions into the fabric of a life that must carry many more sorrows. Yet the cost was real. The House Grande stung, doubled down in ways that left scars. Men were sold to repay supposed debts. Curfews tightened. Children were kept nearer the watchful line of eyes. The ledger's numbers grew more clever at erasing the realities that had forced its exposure. Some of the older women who had aided Luía paid with bodies whipped in public for the audacity of defiance. The estate's violence was not merely a retaliation against one woman. It was a strategy aimed at discouraging the many small acts of solidarity that had once allowed names to be kept and hidden. Time, however, had a complicating generosity. The scandal did not settle into a single narrative. Years have a way of wearing down certainty. The magistrate's official account, ordered, tidy, interested in a verdict, did not erase the private stories that continued to be told at hearths and around wells. Children who had once been sold grew into adults with names that remembered the place they had come from. Some tried to reconcile their lives with the ledger's violence by seeking distance. Others found ways to return to the edges of the estate and press their hands to the earth that had carried both suffering and sustenance. Luía in the Quilombo aged into a kind of steady presence. She did work, she mended garments, she taught other mothers songs that made names stay in the mouth like bread. She sat sometimes watching the river and would speak of Elisa to those who asked, but rarely to those who would not listen. When she slept, nightmares came like debts. When she woke, she sometimes felt that the weight she bore was not wholly her own, but a measure of the way the world had been arranged to make mothers lose their children. There were moments of tenderness that refused the ledger's logic. A child born within the Quilombo would be brought to her and be given to her hands, as if to say that some things could not be bought. She would cradle those children and tell them stories that were not of saints or chancellors, but of names kept alive. In the softness of those moments, she sometimes found, faintly, that the world had not only ledgers and losses, it had also hands. But peace was always partial. The memory of the public moment, the day the lady was exposed, would visit Luía again and again, like a song with a chorus she could not change. Sometimes she would wonder, sharply, if there had been another way. Had there been a possible future in which the ledger could be contested without the splash of violence? She would not pretend to answers. The Quilombo's elders argued that not every action can be judged by an untroubled standard. They said that systems of dispossession create situations in which moral calculus bends under pressure of survival and love. As years folded into decades, the story of Luía changed names in the telling. Some told it as a cautionary tale about the cost of daring. Others told it as a testimony to motherhood's fierce persistence. Oral memory favored the image of a mother with a name in her mouth who refused to be silent. People debated whether Luía had overstepped the bounds of what was allowable, whether she had been avenged or had avenged wrongly. No single answer satisfied all. That, the Quilombo's elders would say, was part of what the telling was for, to keep argument alive so that complacency could not settle. Occasionally, men who had been youngsters in that scandalous morning would come to the edge of the Quilombo, eyes darting, voice low. They brought news of fields, of new laws, of how the ledger had become cunning in other ways. They spoke, too, of how some owners had changed the forms of their violence into more hidden exactions, debts, fines, and contracts disguised as charity. The ledger simply learned a new hand. The world, Luía discovered, was honored to reinvent itself in manners that would always demand vigilance. In the last years of her life, she moved with a quiet that was the opposite of surrender. She sat by the river and watched children play with sticks as if they were crowns. She listened to the music of work and the debates of younger women who were less certain than she had once been. She offered counsel when asked and kept silence when it was wiser. Sometimes she would tell the story of Elisa to a child who asked, framing it not as a manifesto, but as a memory. "She held my 2 fingers like a promise," she would say, and that was enough. Luía never achieved the kind of vindication that fills courtrooms, but she gained something else, the continued recognition that a ledger's numbers are not the sum of a life. Over time, the story of that day, of the throw, of the public exposure in 1832, slid into the region of memory that resists tidy histories. Some accounts dotted it with heroism, others dotted it with condemnation. In oral tellings, the moment became a mirror for questions that have no simple moral math. How far does a mother go to retrieve a name? What does justice look like when the law is stacked against you? And can an act that hurts one person open a window for many? Those who tell the story now, keepers of memory in the Quilombo, a few careful local chroniclers, the descendants of people whose lives were rearranged by that day, do so with an understanding of what history contains and what it omits. They speak of the ledger, but also of the small things, the way a seam was hidden, the way a loaf of bread was passed, the way children were taught songs that remembered the names of the lost. They mark the difference between what was recorded in the magistrate's book and what was kept in mouths and hands. They insist gently that to narrate is not always to conclude. If one looks for victory in the accounts, they will find complexity instead. The lady, Shahar, retreated into a life of guarded sovereignty and legal protection, suffering reputation's erosion, but surviving by law's favor. The estate tightened its rules and punished those it could. Benedito's conscience, if such a thing moved him, remains an unread ledger. The capataz continued for a time to enforce order with memorized severity, and Luía, who had acted in a single fierce breath, lived the remainder of her years in the grey zone between condemnation and reverence. What the story leaves us with is a set of questions that do not simplify. It asks us to look at the ways systems turn people into line items and to consider how courage and desperation intersect. It asks whether public exposure can ever be more than a brief interruption in a system that rewrites itself. It asks us to imagine the cost paid by those who aid the fugitive and by those who were punished for the courage of a few. Memory, the Quilombo elders would say, is a kind of moral ledger that refuses the neatness of ink. It keeps names that the House Grande's accounts would prefer erased. It can be messy, imperfect, and partial, but it is also the place where the human measure of loss and love is kept. To tell Luía's story is not to give a final verdict, it is to keep asking whether there are debts the world cannot pay in coin. In a final scene that belongs more to quiet reflection than to a neat ending, Luía sits by a fire as dusk browns the edges of the world. A young woman, her hair braided, a child asleep against her back, asks simply, "Was it worth it?" The question hangs like smoke. Luía looks at the child's face, at the life she now holds in the small improvised community. She remembers Elisa, her name, the small weight of her hand, the ledger's coldness, and answers in a voice that is neither absolution nor confession. "It was a thing I had to do," she says, "for a name, for a remembering." The ledger could not hold that. Whether it was right, ask the river, ask the children. I will tell the story, and you will tell it differently. Carry the name. That is all I ask. The young woman nods, knowing that answers are the inheritance of debate. The fire makes no promises. Night comes, and with it the river's murmuring, the sound the Quilombo recognizes as livelihood and witness. What remains, in the long view, is not the spectacle of the act, but the threads it loosened and the ones it knotted anew. A mother's refusal to accept accounting for a child, the ways neighbors learned to look, the ways recorders wrote and omitted, the Quilombo that continued to harbor namekeepers, and the generations who would argue about the meaning of exposure and the cost of resistance. If you found this reconstituted memory important, share it, so the names keep living. Comment one word, vengeance, or excess, or another, and join the conversation about how we reckon with systems that turn human beings into numbers. This is a dramatized reconstitution inspired by oral histories. Names and details have been adapted to the year named in the title. The story does not claim archival certainty, but seeks to hold the emotional truth of memories that persist across time.